The monumental life of Franklin D. Roosevelt. We're looking at a gripping story of profound personal and national challenges, all met with completely unprecedented responses. Whether you already know the broad strokes of his presidency or you're diving into the specifics of his era for the very first time, stick around. This is a fascinating look at how one leader navigated the absolute most turbulent waters of the 20th century, leaving behind a legacy defined by both unparalleled national salvation and deeply polarizing controversies. Let's set the scene. Assuming the presidency during the absolute lowest point of the Great Depression, Roosevelt faced a fractured, terrified nation. But he helped the American people actually regain faith in themselves by promising prompt, vigorous action. And he delivered this legendary message of hope in his first inaugural address, famously asserting that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That one line really set the tone for a presidency that would fundamentally change the country.
Section 1. Early Life and Sudden Crisis. From Privilege to Paralysis.
To really understand his incredible resilience later in life, we first have to look at his beginnings. Roosevelt started with a truly formidable foundation. Born in 1882 at Hyde Park, New York, into a life of immense privilege, he utilized his elite education, attending both Harvard University and Columbia Law School, to establish his early life. And on St. Patrick's Day in 1905, he married his distant cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt. That forged a partnership that would become absolutely influential in American history.
Now, what's truly fascinating is the sheer speed of his early political rise. Emulating his highly admired fifth cousin, President Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin entered public service as a Democrat, and his ascent was meteoric. He was elected to the New York Senate in 1910, appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy by 1913, and stood as the Democratic nominee for Vice President by 1920. He achieved all of that in just a single decade.
But just as his career was peaking, everything hit a wall. In the summer of 1921, at just 39 years old, disaster struck. He contracted polio. This sudden, brutal medical crisis left him paralyzed, abruptly derailing what seemed like an unstoppable trajectory. He didn't let that be the end of his story, though. Demonstrating indomitable courage, he fought fiercely to regain the limited use of his legs, heavily relying on swimming as therapy. His determination was absolute. At the 1924 Democratic Convention, he dramatically appeared on crutches to nominate Al Smith as the Happy Warrior. It was a triumphant return to the political stage that ultimately culminated in him becoming the governor of New York in 1928.
Section 2. Tackling the Great Depression, a Nation in Collapse.
This intense personal crucible really prepared him for a much larger national one. To grasp the sheer scale of the crisis when he took office for his first of 4 terms in November 1932, consider one staggering number: 13 million. That represents the Americans who were unemployed by March of that year. To make matters worse, almost every single bank in the country was closed. The nation was at an absolute standstill.
So he wasted no time. In his famous first 100 days, he pushed a sweeping program right through Congress. It was designed to bring urgent recovery to business and agriculture, provide direct relief to the unemployed, and help folks in danger of losing their farms and homes. Plus, it pushed for systemic reform, notably through the establishment of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Section 3. Pushback and the New Deal. Controversy and Reform.
Of course, massive change rarely goes unchallenged, right? By 1935, despite some measure of recovery, intense opposition was brewing. On one hand, businessmen and bankers fiercely scorned his economic experiments. They feared budget deficits, they resented labor concessions, and they disliked his decision to take the nation off the gold standard. But Roosevelt didn't back down. In response, he literally doubled down with a new program of reform, bringing us Social Security, heavier taxes on the wealthy, new controls over banks and public utilities, and an enormous work relief program.
Despite this fierce opposition, Roosevelt was re-elected in 1936 over Kansas Governor Alfred Landon by a huge margin. Bolstered by this massive popular mandate, he sought legislation to enlarge the Supreme Court, which had been invalidating many of his New Deal programs. However, this highly controversial court-packing proposal completely failed. It never even received a vote in Congress. Section 4. A Nation at War, the Global Crucible.
Just as the nation wrestled with these profound domestic shifts, a massive crisis was escalating overseas. Initially, Roosevelt sought to keep the United States out of the conflict as Hitler marched through Europe. By 1940, with France fallen and England under siege, he sent Britain all possible aid, strictly short of actual military involvement.
But December 7, 1941, changed everything. The devastating Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America directly into a global war.
Roosevelt quickly organized the entire nation's manpower and resources for a global war he hoped would end in victory for democracy. Always mindful of the mistakes made after World War I, he also devoted a ton of thought to the planning of a United Nations. However, his wartime leadership also included highly controversial domestic actions. In 1942, he signed an executive order which ordered the relocation and containment of Japanese Americans in military internment camps.
This stark containment policy faced intense legal scrutiny from citizens who argued their rights were being violated. But the Supreme Court heard two separate challenges to the existence of the camps, and they ultimately upheld the executive order both times.
Section 5. A complex, unprecedented legacy. History's measure.
As World War II finally drew to a close, Roosevelt achieved a political milestone. In November 1944, he was elected to a fourth term. That single number, 4, cements his status in American history as the only president to ever serve more than 2 terms in office.
However, the physical toll of his long service and his ongoing battle with polio had finally caught up with him. His health deteriorated rapidly as his final term started. On April 12, 1945, right before the war's final conclusion, he died of a cerebral hemorrhage while staying at his little White House retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia.
So, we're left to reflect. From conquering the personal tragedy of polio to guiding a broken nation through the Great Depression and eventually organizing a massive victory in a world war, alongside intense controversies like the court-packing attempt and the Japanese-American internment camps, his time in office undeniably reshaped the modern world. How does history measure a presidency defined by both unparalleled national salvation and deeply polarizing controversies? What is your ultimate takeaway from this unprecedented legacy? Thanks for joining me.